All right, so the microphone checked out. It's 11:04. It's post-election. As you can imagine, I'm a little tired. I stayed up until both former Vice President Biden and then the current president, President Trump, gave their remarks, and that was pretty late by the time President Trump came on, and tucked us in for the evening, so to speak. And so we don't know who the president of the United States is yet. We didn't think that we would know. That was pretty common. There were some individuals who believed that there would be a blue wave. Some believe there may be a red wave, but based upon the polls, it should have been a blue wave, right? The president down 10% here, 10% there, and it really never came out that way. If there was a loser in last night's race, it was the polls and the pollsters. They just cannot seem to get it correct. I don't know what it is about their biases that lead them to making these wild projections that are just kind of so beyond the pale, but it happened in 2016, and it certainly happened again last night. Having said that, very tight. One of the things that I think we learned from 2016 is that Democrats are more likely or have been more likely to utilize mail-in voting or absentee voting, and Republicans are more likely or have been more likely to go out on election day and actually cast their votes, kind of late breakers, so to speak. And that was true to form yesterday into the evening. And so that's why a lot of those states that were red, as they say, going into the wee hours of the night, are still up for grabs, right? Because the absentee votes are counted later. There's not as a quicker return as you and I when we slip our ballots into the voting tabulator. It tabulates it right away, and so you can get those numbers fairly quickly. But as for the absentee ballots, they got to go through or be hand counted, as the case may be, to ensure accuracy, and that takes longer. So we don't know. If I had to bet, and it's probably not proper to bet on this because again, not knowing is not knowing. But if I had to bet, I believe that with so many absentee ballots out and how absentees tend to break, like I said, for the Democrats, there are a number of states that were in play last night that looked red. They're probably going to break blue, and that could include Michigan. It looks like Wisconsin's trailing that way, and so without Wisconsin, without Michigan, the path to hit 270, the majority of electoral votes necessary to win the presidency outright without it going to the House of Representatives, gets very, very tight. Nevada, Arizona, those states. I think Arizona has already been called for the Democrats. The governor and the Trump team has already said, hang on there, this doesn't seem right to us. So we'll see where Arizona goes. That's 11 point, right? So 22-point swing, really, but it's 11 electoral votes. Nevada is up for grabs. It's very close. It's trending Biden. It'll probably stay Biden. I don't know. I mean, I'm shooting from the hips. I'm just telling you what I've seen. Shooting from the hip here, telling you what I've seen, and just trying to get a sense of where we are in terms of absentee voting going on, and what the likelihood is that President Trump actually does better than former Vice President Biden in the absentee counts. If he doesn't, then those states that were already trending blue, they're going to stay blue, and the likelihood that he's not going to do better in absentee votes is just based upon history, and really based upon the Democrat game plan, which was one to really push their base to get out and to vote absentee. Would seem to favor the idea that those absentee votes are going to come back and they're going to again stay favoring Biden. So the likelihood that we're going to, we'll have to wait and see. Georgia still needs to come in. North Carolina still needs to come in. As we said, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then Pennsylvania is a big question mark. The numbers look very strong for President Trump in Pennsylvania, but again, we've got a number of different ballots that are still out there, still being counted. There's some irregularities, so to speak, in Philly. in terms of the continuation of counting and how ballots are ultimately going to be counted. I don't think we saw any widespread anomalies, but I mean, it doesn't matter who wins this presidential election, being so close. Either side, whoever wins, the extreme left and the extreme right are going to cry foul. It's just going to happen. I mean, a blue wave would have been, or a red wave would have been so much better, I think, for the country, regardless of what your sentiment is as to who should be elected, because it shows a clear indication of what the interest of the country is, and it befuddles the idea that there was any kind of shenanigans going on in those vote counts. So that's the lay of the land, as they say right now. Today's lecture is not going to be long. It really is about the election itself. Again, as we talk about, as you look at your electoral college map, and you'll see that there's red states and blue states that have already been called. I would put. I'm not so sure I would put Arizona solidly in the blue column yet. Based upon some of the questions that are out there regarding the votes. I do believe military votes are often part of the absentee ballot, and so some of those states, like Georgia and North Carolina, that have large military contingents, we'll have to see how those states ultimately break. So stay tuned, as they say. Now, what happens if there are some anomalies, right? So how do we distinguish what is a legitimate vote or not a legitimate vote? If it gets so close that we're actually parsing, things like hanging chads, which is something that your parents may be able to inform you about from 2000, or those of you students who are old enough to remember the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, really came down to Florida, and Florida was going to decide who was the winner, and so then each of those votes then became one that that they each every vote mattered, so to speak, and so they were all under scrutiny. If we find ourselves in a situation like that, ultimately the determination of interpretation of kind of the constitutional mandate, really that it's the state legislature in the Constitution, as we went over the state legislature, it determines how electors are appointed from state to state to state. That is in the U.S. Constitution clearly as a role of your state legislatures. So what your state legislatures have put in place as the policies or laws should dictate how the electors are chosen within the state. And so what votes would count, at least for the president, or at least for the presidential electors, would fall ultimately to the courts in its interpretation of what was the intent of the legislators, right? So here we are back to the idea of originalism and the intent, and what was the law meaning to do based upon context, and that may fall to the courts, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which, as we know, just had its last appointment finalized in Amy Coney Barrett taking the vacated seat from the unfortunate death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so now you have a full U.S. Supreme Court, 9 members. It's not 4 and 4, or the potential for a divided court any longer. Now you've got all spotlight on Amy Coney Barrett. And there was a lot of pressure, certainly from the left, because she's seen as a right, appointee from the right side, that she might recuse herself from the elections coming up. She may not be, should avoid any appearance of impropriety given the stakes of the presidential election. But she couldn't sit out for this. That would not be proper. She was appointed. She was appointed based on the merit of her abilities to be a judge in the truest sense, an individual who is unbiased and nonpartisan, and sits on the bench to render those decisions, whether it's decisions that promote the idea that Constitution is living, breathing, changing Constitution should reflect the interests of the people today, based upon the interpretations of the judges as to what those best interests are, or it should be one that follows the letter of the law and the intent of the lawmaker, regardless of the outcome, recognizing that it is the lawmakers and the constitutional amendment process that would change those discrepancies that may not be seen as to the benefit of the people today. That's what legislators do, right? They identify problems and come up with solutions. That's why the Constitution has an Article 5. So all of those things are going to weigh on the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately hearing this case and seeing where it goes. If it gets there, it may not get there, but it is so close, and the country has been so divided that like I said, it's unfortunate that it wasn't a blue wave. It's unfortunate that it wasn't a red wave, because this unknowing uncertainty is just going to sow the seeds of discontent, and we'll ultimately. We'll all find out one way or the other. We're going to end up having a president. Whether that individual is accepted as the president of the United States, we have yet to see. But that's where we are. What's the process moving forward? Again, counting needs to take place. Certification needs to take place. If it's so close, within percentages, depending on the states, right? Depending on the state laws, if it's so close, it may trigger automatic recounts. And so some states that may be within that margin of that 1%, or whatever the margin is, that may trigger automatic recounts. And then, of course, every vote then counts. You got to go in and take a look. Was this ballot a spoiled ballot? What was the intent of the voter? And try to glean that intent. And of course, the Democrats are going to want those votes for Biden to count, and the Republicans are going to want those votes for Trump to count. And the alternative is true. Those votes for Trump, the Democrats aren't going to want to count, and the votes for Biden, the Republicans aren't going to want to count. So it could be very, very, very messy. But regardless of what happens, there are enough safeguards in the process that the country is going to survive. Regardless if you were a full-throated Biden supporter and Trump ultimately continues on with 4 more years. Right, Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives appears to be going to stay in the hands of the Democrats, and if that's the case, you have a divided government and a check of power across the branches. If Biden should win and you are a full-throated Trump supporter and he doesn't get another 4 years, the country will ultimately survive. It appears that the U.S. Senate, is going to remain in the hands of the Republican majority, and so you have a way of a divided government, a check on the different branches, and then what happens is 2022 becomes very, very important as to who's going to ultimately control the legislature, and then 2024 becomes extremely important. So it's these are amazing times to live in, and it's been that way for really since that 2000 election, and we'll, like I said, we'll continue to push forward as a country, and our system of federalism will continue to be challenged and altered, and probably more often than not find itself in the Supreme Court as to whose power, what power, and can we do these things or not. And so all eyes on the court, unfortunately, in my opinion, here for this recount and the presidential election outcome, but also into the future, where we're going to have, I think, a lot of challenges to the idea of what is the country that the people want, what is the country that was envisioned by those who put the structure of government in place. So that's where we are today. I wish I could give you some better, more definitive, a more definitive outlook on steps moving forward, or who's definitely won. But it's going to probably be Thursday, maybe Friday, before we have some idea as to whether there's going to be recounts or not recounts, how close the elections ultimately are, and then if there are recounts, it could be another week, as you have to roll through the votes. I will say this, that the voter turnout based upon projections is something near 70%. That's amazing. Amazing. We talked, I think, early on in class before we broke from COVID that generally speaking, presidential voter turnout's around 55%, 60% on a good election. 63% was a kind of the record of modern day, and so there a lot of people choose to stay home or not involve themselves. 70% of those eligible to vote getting out and voting, that's a pretty big deal. And so and ultimately a good thing, because I think it gives us a clearer picture. It should give us a clearer picture of what direction the whole of the nation wants the country to go. As a republic, states matter. The Electoral College, as we pointed out, it's possible for the popular vote to go to one candidate and the Electoral College to actually favor another. That's by design. Again, as a republic, you have 50 separate states that are all choosing the executive that they believe would act in their best interest as a state to protect their general welfare, to treat them fairly, if not give them an advantage. And that's how the election was really set up. Because you have these huge population, dense populations in states like California or New York, and the problems and issues of California and New York are not necessarily the same as the problems and issues of Iowa or Michigan, for that matter. And so the Electoral College allows, with weighting by population and the equality of the Senate for our number of electoral votes, that allows for a better representation of the interest of the states, but maybe not the interest of the citizens as a whole. But again, California is not Iowa, New York is not Michigan, right? And nobody's kooky like Idaho, so everybody has a hand in this game as to what type of executive branch they would like to see. All right, guys, I don't really have anything more than that. Article 6 and 7 of your Constitution were really gone over on Monday's lecture. The thing to remember, just as you look at your sections in Moodles, you have that test coming up next week, and that would be next week Monday, or if you're my Tuesday Thursday class, next week Tuesday. And I'll send out the obligatory message email out to just remind you that that test is coming up and to not miss its deadline. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to email me, williamshea@kellogg.edu, and stay tuned. Nothing else I can say other than stay tuned. That's it.